future architecture and design processes. And of course, we're going to talk about, AI, our dependency on 3D printing, downloadable 3D designs towards a robotic construction system. But why don't we focus on something which a little bit more human-oriented, and that is something to do with very important in design processes, and that is hiring, and how each firms encounters the future of hiring. And particularly, we're going to come up with a lot of millennials coming to work in our firm. So shall we start with Matthew? Tell us about your experiences or any anecdotes with hiring.
What we're finding in our firm is, obviously, with the millennials coming through, there's a very big focus on very quick turnaround, instant gratification. So what we're seeing a trend is the dependence on the computers and on smartphones and the like. So the way our business is heading is more into a more computer and analytical style of architecture, and trying to utilise these computer minds that are now so prevalent, and using them to really help us inform the design process, not just using CAD and 3D visualization. That's something that's done quite regularly now. It's quite commonplace, but it's more about taking the intelligence from these young people and being able to use their scripting abilities and their computer programming abilities to help us inform the design process. So they're the sort of skill sets, or these smart creatives that we look for as a firm.
Thanks. I think you covered most of the topics. If I can take one step further, we understand that with the availability of new technology would help to speed up the process of designing and particularly in architecture. But imagine in the near future when a software can learn how to learn like a human being and be creative like a human being, not to mention being better. So what's the design and architecture going to be looks like?
I'm gonna talk about something about communication. Currently in our studio, we actually use Pinterest to design. Now, how many of you uses Pinterest? None? Now, it's quite interesting because when I was training, I had to draw a line. But when we start talking about drawing lines, it's no longer in fashion. I mean, obviously, people are very astute in computer technologies. But what is more interesting, I think, is we are at an age where we can literally build our dreams. If you look at all the kind of work of Zaha, it's been happening because of the technology. So I think the technical aspect, to me, is being solved as we speak. But increasingly in the millennials, because there's so many ideas that's proliferating every moment, there's a greater need to communicate, there's a greater need to curate. So a lot of the times when we work in our studio, it's about communicating, and I think the best way for us to do it is using Pinterest. We talk using images rather than talk about lines. I mean, that was the communicative protocol, let's say, in the last 20, 30 years. But I think moving forward, this generation is incredibly literate in images. And if you're in the development business, I'm sure you have social media outreach, and it's all in images. And a picture speaks 1,000 words. So I think that's something interesting to look at.
I think you're right there that it's just made me think about something about communication, and again, not just communicating amongst ourselves as designers, but also communicating with our clients and communicating with the end user, and going back to the computer and sort of analytical analysis of big data, taking information from the people that are going to use those buildings to help define and design the buildings, rather than leaving that to be a process at the end of a project to test and see how the end user are enjoying the experience, but actually use it at the front end and communicate with our clients and with the users of the buildings to actually understand how are they going to work in that building, how are they going to use that building, how are they going to function within those spaces. scripting that and applying that to the design process at the front end to create better architecture. So I think it's about communication and how that can then be transferred into the actual design process and how that manifests itself as if it's in imagery or in the three-dimensional world in the computer. I think that's the really exciting next steps for all of us as designers.
I think it's very interesting what you've said, particularly about instant gratifications just now. I think architecture is all about team building, at least in the design process we're talking about here. And what we have found is that the technology is not only affecting the way we design, but the technology is influencing the design team so much in a very deep way, and that is, I think millennials especially, I think there's a lot of study being done right now trying to analyze the psychographics of this new generation that are brought up on emoticons, on reality TV, on like online shopping, that they don't buy anything in shops unless they have actually checked out all the 50 prices available online. And one thing that I talk to them, of course, because they're obviously, in my team. And I find that because everything is so accessible, there's a problem that everything becomes univalent, and that is, everything is it's like a data entry. By that I mean, they go to Wikipedia, and basically anything like Hitler or the Taj Mahal or the Encyclopedia Britannica, if anybody can remember that, it's just a data entry, and to them, they don't know what is more important or what context, and how those things are related chronologically or historically or in terms of, I think even emotionally. Because when I was a student, I had to go to the library, find one image. Actually, I remember now, I started at the AA, the Architectural Association, where Zaha Hadid was a former student, and I used to see her all the time. But we had a slide library. What the Architectural Association was really famous for was a slide library with 50,000 slides. They're tiny, of course, right? You go to the slide library, it was just we thought it was so cool, so advanced, to find one slide, one image from the 1930s. Maybe, I don't know, Rietveld or some kind of like really obscure architect, which are not available in a book. But now you go to Google search and there will be, within usually they tell you 0.59 second, you find 5,000 images. And great, that sounds wonderful, but when everything's so accessible, then the value of the information and the images or everything to do with research becomes lessened, I think. And to me, that affects the design team because they don't know what to them, everything, a carrot is the same as, a palace, it's the same as a fish, it's the same as a philosophy or a pop song or a reality show character. And that is definitely going to affect. And that leads up to the next question is education, because you can actually learn everything on YouTube. That's the truth. There's going to be something like university YouTube one day. And people don't need to go to university. They can learn everything on their own. And we have had staff who never went to any kind of formal training, who did amazing work. They don't know a lot about other stuff, but they can do one thing really well. And for whatever reasons, we don't have time to go into the background of these individuals. And that becomes stunning because I see that in the future, there will be people like that. They didn't go to university. We just found them. And they can do work better than a lot of, shall we say, formally trained professionals. And that is also going to affect the design process. I think I'm more interested in that myself. And yes, instant gratification, they want to be a part of it. And I think the makeup of the team also, like It used to be like the architects at the top and then the trainees or whatever at the bottom. Things are not going to be like that.
Yeah, I think it's become a lot more sort of unilateral. That there's, obviously we all sit in studios who don't have the guys sitting off in their ivory towers anymore. It's, everyone interacts and works together. And I think that the back onto the instant gratification about what I always find quite exciting is when one of the younger staff, you see they've tweeted the latest building that we're working on, and obviously there's something that they're proud of, and there's that imagery that goes along with the projects, and something that they're wanting to share with their friends and see how many likes they can get on Facebook, and that makes them feel special. And no, I think that exactly what you're talking about with the people that are not necessarily formally trained, but architecture, something that I've always really enjoyed about it is it brings together so many people and so many different disciplines. Typically you have the architect, the engineers, the developers, now your landscape and all those sorts of things, but it's about bringing everybody together, and it's now becoming more and more prevalent in the teams that we work on, that it isn't just restricted to those sort of three main disciplines. You have artists, you have computer software engineers, you have a whole bunch of different people that maybe 20, 30 years ago you wouldn't have necessarily brought together on a project, but now the consultant team is a lot broader, and it's actually, I think, a really good thing, and it's really exciting as an architect and designer to be able to be exposed to such a broad range of different minds that they have, because architecture, it's an equalizer of it's like any other kind of art. Everyone has an opinion, and that's the blessing and the curse of what we do, that everybody either loves something or hates it, and it's, well, I don't like that building. Well, just because you're not an architect, you have an opinion on that building, because you don't have a choice. You have to walk past it every day, you have to work in it, live in it, all those sorts of things. So it's, everybody has an opinion on the kind of artistic endeavours that we are part of as an architect. So bringing together a whole raft of people that are from very different backgrounds, and whether they're formally trained or not, everybody has an opinion on design, and that's something that we look for in our teams, about bringing a big group of people together and taking and distilling all of those ideas and applying them to the design process to make a better outcome.
I'd just like to contribute. It's very interesting. Before I came yesterday, or the day before, I read this statement. Millennials don't want to own possessions. They want to own experiences. So I think the key word here is experience. And I think this could be linked to this notion of everything is flat and every information is available by a touch of a finger. But the other compensating element to it is you crave for real experience. If you look at the amount of hipster cafe that's popping out in every corner of the world, we have a few in Haji Lane. I'm sure you have your hipster cafes in Subang Jaya here as well. It's very clear that all these young people, although they have access to the computer freely, but innately we are all human, and you do need physical touch. What you cannot find in a computer, you get to the physical world to get it. And that's where we come in play. I really like the idea of the previous presentation about livable cities. Why is it livable? Because it's a lived experience. It's about creating that memorable, that cool place to be in. And I totally agree with Matthew insofar as the architecture is exciting, because nowadays it is not the architect saying everything. There's many voices in the project. I think that's a great thing, because that's the way we create great lived experience, great places to be in, to live in, to be seen in, and we share it immediately.
I think you brought up just one very interesting topic, which the training of the architecture career. I remember my grandfather, when I was 12, my grandfather told me that your future already started yesterday. So in architecture, the institutionalized of architecture career is quite a short history. Before, architecture very much been designed by just about everyone. And from my anticipation in the future, it's going to be just about everyone can do the design and formulate the built environment. So where the future for architect be in that context, It could be that we would be moving toward a more philosophy field in which we will guide a developer or actual owner of the built environment to design their own built environment, and we become a more or less like an inspirational source.
I agree. I think that there's an end of the sort of the starchitect, and there used to be, that was the big thing, that you get your starchitect and that's the name that is the designer of your building and that sort of thing. But I think that more and more it's becoming, like you said, that it's about the experience and it's about the user of that building. You know, the developer who sells a building might have there may be some sort of cachet that they can attach with a big name starchitect to their buildings, which I think is happening less and less perhaps, but the end result is something that the users, they don't really care who the person was that designed their building, they just want a good building to live in and work in and be part of. So it's an interesting thing how the education process will change and develop for architects. I've always seen our role as the facilitators of a project. It's the person that herds the cats and brings everybody together. And there's always that genesis of an idea that begins with the creatives. But then where that then goes, there's this kind of, it's always been a team process. But I think that this notion of a grand master who, does the big thing, the big drawing and pontificates and wears a black cape and all those sorts of things, I think the end of that era has finished, and it's now more about architects being facilitators of the design process, coming up with the initial ideas perhaps, but then bringing everybody together and moving it forward in a direction that I keep harping on about it, but it's that end result, it's the end user experience that's of most importance, and I think that's something that I find really important.
So I think that's a great, line to move on to the next section. That is the design trends. And I think Terence touched upon something really interesting. He said that the millennials are more interested in experiences and not so much in possessions. And actually, I questioned that a little bit. But we all read that somewhere. It's all in the, on the web. And these research, and this whole collective subconsciousness, which we talked about just now, how we perceive the superstructure of the design team or the design profession, I think that is really interesting, because I personally, I'm more cynical in a way, the way things are done on the media, and how the media is actually affecting us so much, creating a peer pressure to so that we have a perception of architecture or the environment in a way that the media wants us to perceive. And for example, it's very, one of the things that I came up with when I was thinking about design trends is that what if the reality show TV is also going to move into architecture? I mean, that sounds crazy. What are you talking about? But I was looking at the Apple Center being built by Foster, and they have these drones flying around, taking photographs of the construction, with some music, of course. And then I thought, what happens if, you have these drones flying around all the major projects in the world? One in Dubai, or not one, 10 in Dubai, 10 in Malaysia, 15 in Hong Kong, 20 in Beijing. And then you have a channel that talks about these buildings like a reality show nonstop, and then, showing construction, interviewing people, and getting feedback from the public or the professionals on how this building ought to go. Like, okay, this is a disaster, or this is so great, or everything has got a thumbs up or a thumbs down, and everything becomes like politicized.
Sad face.
A sad face, yeah. Or worse. And it becomes very interesting that how architecture becomes like a real community thing, like almost going back to the Gothic ages, where it's a very collective activity where, exactly what you said, it's actually, we're going back in that respect. Like a cathedral takes like 500 years to build, and it would touch upon all the different artists' lives, professions. Everybody contributed, and not idyllically. I mean, if that's such a word. Like, not that everybody was really happy about paying up to build this cathedral, but everybody had to participate because it's such a big project. It was so hard to build anything, and they hired Freemasons, and generations of them. And I think that is also, but now that sort of collective thing going on, it happens on the web, on a global scale. And I think that is going to play out in a very interesting way, which we cannot fathom at this moment, because it's only one or two projects are like that, like the Apple headquarters.
But I think the media has always played a big part in, especially in major public works, that there's always been a lot of coverage, and the media likes to pick up on a story. If it's a good story or a bad story, it doesn't really make much difference so long as it is a story in itself. And I think so. It kind of the future that you're talking about kind of scares me to a degree, because I think that there's enough public debate on architecture as it is, which is a good thing. I think it's, in where I'm from in Melbourne, I remember when Federation Square was being built, and I'm not sure if anyone here is familiar with that project or not, but it polarised Melbourne. I can't remember where I was in my career at that point, but I'd graduated and I was working in a firm in Melbourne, and you'd go out for a drink on a Friday night and you'd go to one of the bars or the restaurants or whatever in Federation Square, and what was there previously was these hideous gasworks buildings, and they were an eyesore, and there was a really dodgy fish and chip shop downstairs, and it was just rubbish. So what they did was they knocked it all down, and they decked over active rail, which is obviously a feat in itself, and built something that was well over budget. But at the end of the day, it created a focal point in Melbourne, and there's always been this Sydney-Melbourne rivalry. Sydney have the Opera House and the Harbour Bridge, and Melbourne has good coffee. So that's the only saving grace that we can kind of say. But when Federation Square was built, and you'd go and visit there, and it goes back to what I was saying earlier about everybody having an opinion on architecture. It polarised Melbourne in a lot of ways, but it made architecture a very hot topic for everybody in the city, regardless of whether you were an architect or not, regardless of whether you loved it or you hated it. All of a sudden, everybody had an opinion on architecture, and it expanded out past this one building and made people look to the other buildings in Melbourne with a more critical eye is the wrong word, but people started to look at their city in a different way. I think that they were starting to have that discussion and that discourse amongst themselves about the design trends and what makes a good building and what doesn't, and how Federation Square operated, and whether they thought it was good or whether they thought it was bad. But at the end of the day, it's been, I don't know how old the building, the development is now. It's probably 10, 15 years old, but it's still very much an active heart of Melbourne. It's on the Yarra River. It's got a very big open plaza where everybody congregates for. They haven't got tickets to the MCG for the grand final, or they don't have tickets to the tennis or whatever. They all congregate. They put the chairs out and they watch it in the Federation Square main plaza. So it's. I think the media has always been a platform for people to voice their opinions on architecture and design. If it becomes a 24-hour reality TV show, I'm not sure how that will be a benefit or not, but it's something that obviously is a possibility.
I think it's beneficial for those who like to watch 24-hour reality shows. But I think, if you look at the history of architecture, it has always got a very tenuous relationship with media. When they first built the Eiffel, probably half of Paris thought it was the ugliest building on earth. But if you go to Paris, you would be quite silly not to visit Eiffel. I think the difference is with technology, that speed of circulation has been exponential. It's already happening, the kind of reality show. If you look at BIG's project in New York, every week on my Arch Daily or the Zine, I will see or every month I'll see some updates of how nice the curves are going out. And I actually think it's quite a nice thing to be able to reach out to the general public about these really important projects in cities. And I think whether you take those comments or it's quite good to have that discussion and that as well. Interestingly, about this notion of the profession and the trend growing towards kind of assemblage system of producing design. The latest Turner Prize winner in UK is actually an architectural practice called Assemble. You would think, what has an architectural firm got to do with artists? Turner Prize is usually given to the major artists in UK on a Tate. But they are a bunch of students who haven't even got their, I think, accreditation, and they just went along to this village in North England, I think, and they just wanted to do this great community building underneath, I think it was a viaduct. And they just talked to those houses along the street, and they just finished it. And they did it in a way which is very collaborative. It's almost like a medieval process. It's amazing if you look at the whole process and see where they eventually come out with, and all the kind of barriers they had to go through against the local borough and how they won them eventually. I think it's quite an interesting way of practicing architecture. The problem, I think, is a lot of the modern kind of bureaucratic instruments are very slow to react to the way society moves, especially in this kind of digital age. And but I think there are inspirations that we could always look at and see how we can find lessons in them.
So, okay, let's move on a little bit, and also about design trends in the future and how technology, particularly related to reduced fossil fuel dependency, how that game changer is going to affect our way of designing houses, where you can have graphene solar panels on the roof, running your air conditioning, your Tesla, your iPod, your iPhone, whatever. There are no iPods anymore, sorry. Grow your own vegetables, fruits, chicken, eggs. You collect rainwater, and for flushing and cooking, you have 3D printers. And if you have a problem with medical, if you have a medical problem, you have a drone flown in with your antibiotics. So how that kind of vision of the future, which is possible, especially possibly in Australia, thing. It's almost like a Mad Max without the violence, and the oil struggle. How do you see that trade? Do you see that this whole shift towards solar energy or non-fossil fuel-based energy is going to affect architecture in a big way, and how?
Well, I think it's going to affect not just architecture, but the whole society indeed. So we've got to look into architecture as part of an emerging society or the social structures. It sounds scary, but it's obviously the energy or resources on this earth is limited. So whatever we are doing is not going to last forever.
I actually think there's quite a few interesting ramifications that you're already noticing. If you look at the major highways, they are turning them into parks, which are great, because those are great urban, urban spaces for people. So I agree with Trey. Actually, architecture is always at the end. At the end of the day, the humans are kind of changing. And I think this notion of smart city is really interesting. When a city or a country is no longer fossil-based, what happens? Now, I would encourage, I think this is kind of controversial, I would say don't build anymore. Only because there really is a lot of building, and this is a disaster for architects. But I would say revise your city. Your city has immense space, immense redundancy, which is based on fossil. And if you look at the current trend, it's very clear that you do not need that much infrastructure and in KL, it's very clear that you're developing your infrastructure in terms of transport infrastructure. In Singapore, you're right to say we are doing ERP. In fact, we are doing GPS. Very soon, we do not have gantries. The government will track our every life, our private lives as well. But I think the beauty of it is then we are trying to aim for a car-like society in future, hopefully carless. And what is going to happen is we're going to move around in PDDs, personal transport devices, all these little things that my son, the Unisegway, is incredibly kind of adept at. And it's a different kind of city. It will be quite interesting because a lot of the spaces that you traditionally would have for huge amounts of car parks, you have to be really creative. What are you going to do with them? So I think those are interesting moments, especially in mature cities, which has been developed based on a carbon or kind of carbon-heavy path. it's really to start thinking, how do we revise the city? What's the city version 3, version 4, version 5?
I think maybe it's a good time, actually, this is like halfway, it's a good time for the audience to participate. So it's not like, end of session and then any questions or any comments and then, so anything, on the floor, anyone would like to contribute and talk about what we're talking right now, please feel,
Continuing on what you
go
just said,
down.
the notion of Airbnb and how that's going to affect hotel building and hotel constructions, that almost the double use of residential houses to double up as hotels for visitors, and so that's basically going to affect almost the construction of new buildings and hotels. And
not only hotel, I mean, if you look at the biggest the biggest office developer, or if you can call him a developer, WeWork, they have the biggest pool of offices, but they don't own any one of them, as I understand. So you have WeWork, you have Airbnb, and then you have the traditional developer model. I mean, in the industry, there's this big scary word called consolidation. But I think for a consumer, that's great. When I go for holiday, I go for Airbnb, I'm sorry. But that also gives us the opportunity to be innovative.
Sorry, what did you say? You go to what?
Airbnb, when we go for holiday.
Airbnb.
Yeah, so I mean, it's good price and then you get a great experience. Of course, I do use conventional hotels, but I think there is a lot of opportunity when the economy turns, and then you just have to deal with the consolidation. There will be consolidation, but there will be pockets of opportunities. And so the greatest challenge for us all, including myself as an architect, is really finding this moment where the economy generally needs to change gear. This is not a isolated phenomenon. We have in Singapore, if you go to conferences hearing people from Shanghai, they have the same issue, but it's really interesting listening to how other cultures or other kind of economies deal with it. So I think that's interesting, which is why I keep talking about revising your city, revising all your products. What exactly do we need? Do we need more houses? Do we need more kind of unique kind of single-use kind of buildings? Or it's all going to be mixed, but mixed not only in physical space, but mixed in time.
So actually, what you said was really interesting, Terence, because you said Airbnb, and then suddenly I have a vision of Westworld, if you know what that word means. It's like an experience that you can buy. You live in the house of some writer or someone else's life. It's like living someone else's life for a day or two. And maybe this whole millennial thing is also tied up with this, that people want experiences. And we haven't gone to that part where, you go into the West world, you become a cowboy and you shoot people, and then it's all actually just robots. That's an extreme version. But before we reach that fantasy stage, we go through this stage, which is like you live through other people's lives precariously. It's really interesting, and architecture becomes an instrument to help people to experience more, real or unreal, fantasy or non-fantasy. And that is really interesting, and that is going to be a big bubble, because I think people want to know what it is like to live in a real home, well, as real as it can be, of someone else's, not a fake home. Or the whole house of Charles Dickens, for example. Not that we can live there, of course. It actually exists, and it's like a museum piece. But maybe some writer, maybe a photographer, you can actually live in a photographer's house, or a chef's house, and you can buy that experience. And that would be so interesting, because somebody might really, maybe I always wanted to become a chef, and I could never, because I did architecture, so now I can't be a chef. I'm so frustrated, and I just want to live like a chef for 2 days. That sort of thing, but live in his house, not just going to learn from the chef. And I think that would be really fascinating, and that could be something that design and architecture will grow into, and that collectively, the whole city as well, becomes like a theme park. I mean, it sounds like a dirty word in architecture, but it's not, because it's all about, that's a sort of design bubble which will propel us into another era and another area, whatever you call it, in creating something new for the public, which has a demand at the moment. Sorry, you're going to say something?
I agree very much. I think Alex touched on a very important thing. Usually when we do retail there, I mean, a lot of people come to us thinking that we can create magic by doing a very successful retail mall. But to be very honest with you, every successful mall has a very successful developer and a very successful marketing and leasing thing. There's one thing which is always kind of overlooked, and that's I call it the hardware and software. The content really is very important. And actually, we may think that buildings are very, very flexible, but they can be flexible to a certain extent if the content is very well defined. So, Alex, you brought a really interesting point about, what if we could live in a writer's house? What if we could live in a photographer's house? That content is a real lived content, authentic content. It's not thematized content, actually. I know it's themed, but I think there is a fine line between a theme park like Disneyland and what you're talking about, which is far more kind of authentic. And I really think the millennials are after that. I mean, they do like their Disneyland, but they do also want their authentic experiences.
Sorry, I used the wrong word. It was not precariously. It was vicariously. That's what I meant. Okay, so that's a great way to move into the next section, which is home design and architecture in 2050. And actually on the list, I said we're going to have gated communities with ultra-luxury palatial mansions, and in contrast to that, prefab housing for refugees. Not that there'll be an Airbnb to live like a refugee for a day. I don't think people would want that. But there's a polarization of rich and poor. We all know that. And we're like moving into a neo-Edwardian age at the moment. And becomes very, very, Downton Abbey. And it becomes very scary too. But on the other hand, we have to face up to what's going on. And as architects, we have to we have to build housing for refugees and also palatial mansions at the same time. And on top of that, micro-living in ultra-expensive cities, that's where I come from, Hong Kong, where the apartments are so small, so tiny. That was a CNN again. That was a big thing about this guy. The whole bathtub can shift, or you actually sit on the bathtub and watch movies with your friends. It's like so multi-purpose. They did this. This guy spent $1 million Hong Kong doing up his tiniest apartment, and every gadget. I mean, every trick of the trade was pulled out, and it was just, it's like crazy. And that would be something. And then, of course, there'll be temporary buildings for urban nomads, like living under the flyover, like living, underneath redundant structures of urban structures, or prefab colonies on Mars as well, which Norman Foster is doing, or someone like Norman Foster is doing. Tell us about what your idea of home design. Tell us what you're experiencing.
Look, I think it varies from place to place. I think you're right. In places like Hong Kong, there are the ultra tiny apartments. Again, even though I live in Kuala Lumpur, I'm referring back to Australia here. But they're bringing in place, and there's new planning restrictions on how small apartments can actually be, and there's mandatory requirements for natural daylight and natural ventilation and those sorts of things. I think that there is that fine line between developer driven aspects to a project, but then there's also good design that needs to come through as well. And you said something earlier about growing your own crops and those sorts of things, and because we're a lesser dependency on fossil fuels, I don't think we're all going to become farmers, but I think the good design is something that's going to be very much something that needs to be focused on. That it's not just about design, building something because you've got a block of land and this is your plot ratio, and I'm going to throw up a 60-story residential tower and hope that investors buy it because it's a good place to put their money and don't rent it out. I think it's something that you need to rely heavily on the design team to actually create good buildings and good architectural outcomes. That I see a lot of the over the past sort of 6 to 10 years, this development of GBI indexes and platinum and LEED and all these sorts of different environmental stickers that you can put on your building to make you feel good about the project that you've built. But in reality, if it's a good design and it's good architecture, it should be taking into account the the passive solar, how you orientate the building, how you shade the facade that takes a lot of solar gain, how can you naturally ventilate and get cross ventilation through. The presentation before we came up here about there's an image of the Malaysian vernacular of the houses elevated off the ground, open on both sides to allow that natural ventilation, allowing free flow of air underneath the building to again cool it down. There was no air conditioners, there was no reliance on triple glazed double facades and the like. So, and I'm starting to see it a bit here in Malaysia, which is exciting about that, a resurgence of looking back to utilising the geography of where we are and responding to the environmental conditions with the buildings that are going up. There are a lot that aren't. There's a lot of just big glass dump boxes that are being built, but I think that there's a few buildings and the aesthetic of certain projects aren't what excite me. It's what those projects are actually trying to do, creating breezeways to allow a lesser dependency on air conditioning. And you said something about the putting PV cells on your roof to run your air conditioner. Well, rather than running PV cells on your roof to run your air conditioner, well, don't have an air conditioner at all, but design your buildings properly to allow you to have a cool environment and a tempered space without actually having to rely on that. So that's where I think the reliance on good design is going to become more and more important. And almost, it needs to be mandatory that the buildings that we do respond to these things and don't rely on mechanical ventilation and air conditioning and all those sorts of things. It needs to be about employing all the great design techniques and elements that all of the people back in the day used to do, because that's just the way it was. Why would you put a veranda around your house? Because it makes my house cooler. Those sorts of things that are what I think we read to. It's not just about building a big edifice that's going to win lots of awards because it photographs nicely. It's about a building that responds to its environment and responds to the people inside of it, and actually alleviates that necessity for the fossil fuel dependency.
Alexander, sorry to interrupt. I'm just going to have to ask a question. We have to conclude because we're a bit pressed for time, but I've got a question over here.
I'm Jojo Fabricante from Abida Land from the Philippines. I think your discussions on future architecture and design is very interesting and very insightful, so I'd like to thank you on that. However, I'm quite curious on what your opinions are in the matters of the future of architecture. You were mentioning a while ago about the design being responsive to the culture and behavior of millennials, which prompts me to ask, have there been already thoughts from your design firms on the next generation, which I think is Generation Z, I think. And since have you already been thinking of these, the emerging trends of the upcoming generation? And you were also, number two, you were also mentioning about the trending of micro apartments, not just in Hong Kong, Alexander, but also even in the US and even in Manila. So with this trend of micro apartments, the Gen Z, and also inclusiveness, not just the usual solar technology and also the passive cooling and all. Fourth, do you also have thoughts on the technology of architecture for nanotechnology? You also mentioned, Alexander, the 3D printing, and what other future thoughts that you already have in your brainstormings? Thank you.
Sorry, what did you say? What was the last word?
Alexander.
The last word in your hour.
What are your thoughts already, including in your designs, stuff like nanotechnology and the layouts using inclusiveness?
Oh, okay. Well, actually, I think it's addressed to all of us. And thanks for the questions and the comments. I think the millennials thing, of course, it's actually, I think millennials are anyone born after like 95, because that means that they would be 5 when they would the year 2000 or something like that. It's not, I think millennials is not people born after the year 2000. So they will be in the workforce very soon, and we don't know how to handle them actually, because it is new, of course. And anything about micro apartments is that we actually think that there will be no sitting rooms, living rooms in the future. It's all going to be one big area where people eat. That's the only activity that people will actually stop for 5 minutes not looking at their cell phone. And if you actually go to Hong Kong and you go to these like restaurants and family outings, I mean, we have to watch people because we design for people, not for ourselves. And there'll be this family, and then the dad will be on the phone talking. The mom will be on the, you know, doing some shopping probably on the cell phone. And then the sons and daughters are definitely looking at their cell phone, on their iPhone. And what kind of family is that? I actually, to be honest, I think that one day the children will be talking to their parents via WhatsApp during dinner. Because they were brought up not to speak. To them, anything that involves verbal, like articulation, is very unsophisticated, shall we say. Because they think that everything that can be typed out, why speak it? And then also you can copy and paste. So why repeat what, you know, I mean, do something mechanically. No, it's not mechanical, what is it? And anatomically, when you can do something electronically. And that is becoming very, it's going to be really serious. And this mind control being done via the web, and the way it affects the young people. And they have their own world, actually. They have their own, everything they do is very secretive. They have their own codes and stuff. And it's really, really affecting the family, and therefore affecting the way we design houses. Like, as I said, people don't watch TV anymore. I mean, people don't even go to movies. I do a lot of cinemas, but that's in China. People don't go to movies in Hong Kong. People don't actually watch movies at home even. No, I mean, they watch it in their bedroom or watch it on their cell phone, but not collectively, like, you know, using the TV as an anchor, like a fireplace. So that's going to affect the way we live, even in these micro apartments. And I think you mentioned about nanotechnology, things like that. That is definitely going to come, I think. We actually haven't reached the stage where we're using a lot of 3D printing. And things like, you know, technologies like, we know that it's there, and then it would be up and down, up and down. I think that the MakerBot, you know, the 3D printer, they weren't doing so well. They're projecting huge increase in growth, and it didn't happen. But it will come. But as I said, we are as, what is the word, as inspired and also as scared as you are, because we don't know what's going to happen. And that also makes architecture very exciting, because it's very collective, and we don't know where anything can happen. It's really, well, it's like politics. Anything can happen.
I find it quite depressing, the thought that I'm not going to speak to my children anymore. But no, like, I think that there is obviously a dependency on screen time and those sorts of things. But you know, maybe it's going to go the other way. I remember hearing once about the best way to stop your children using Facebook is to get mum and dad on there, because then it's not cool anymore and they won't use it. And so maybe that's something that we all need to, you know, just pull those cell phones away from the children and the iPads, and, you know, try and engage with them more. And hopefully, if you're designing buildings that are that do have those communal spaces and do have areas where people can come and want to put their phones away, it's about engagement and trying to engage with people. And, you know, in my house, we don't have, you know, there's no phones at the table, there's no iPads, and, you know, having a meal together. And I think what you said is very, very important. We don't sit down as a family and watch TV, but we'll sit down as a family and have a meal together. And it's about that community, and especially if you're living, as more and more of us are going to, living in high-rise buildings, you can have a very, very large concentration of people in a very small footprint. It's how those buildings then come to ground and the facilities at the base that enable that interaction. I've recently just moved into a condo from a house. I know more people in my condo building now and have more social interaction with them than I did in my suburb here in Kuala Lumpur. Whereas in Australia, it's the other way around. You live in a condo or an apartment, you wouldn't really see anybody. But in your street, you have your street parties and you know your neighbours, and it's a very, very different experience. So I think it's about, like I said, it scares me to think if we are going to be communicating via WhatsApp at the dinner table, but I think hopefully through creation of more community-focused and communal spaces within not just residential but commercial and retail buildings, it actually will hopefully bring people together more and alleviate that reliance on screen time, perhaps.
We're running out of time, and we don't have time to go into commercial developments in 2050. So we'll come back next year and talk about this. But last word, Trey and Terence, a few words before we wrap up.
No, I'm sort of just agreeing with Matthew, with the polarization between private space and public space. I think you have to deal with the public space. You have to create great public space, and in between the public and the private, there is a private-public space, which is all the condominium facilities. Those could be very, very engaging and wonderful, and you just need to create the same kind of attraction that they are getting from the iPad or whatever.
My last word for today. I think the future for architecture and design is not going to be as scary as we are worrying about. I think all the problem with micro housing, micro apartments, the fact that family members no longer talking to each other directly, it's not going to be that problematic. I believe that all the problem coming from the fact that we are so depending on the current model of working space in which we all have to work at the same place. So if that can be changed, and we all can work from distant, from home, and that will allow us to have the space and the opportunity to still stay together as a family or as a community, then the whole problem will go away.
So next time we're going to talk about, when we come back, next year, unmanned hotels with robots, airport hubs where professional global nomads stay and work, giant longevity health centers disguised as theme parks where people live till they reach 120 years old, and stylistic integration. Shopping malls, hotels, airports, hospitals, schools, museums, workplace, prisons will all look and feel the same. So thank you very much. Hello, this is Alexander Wong again, and this is during the gala presentation of awards for the Asia Pacific Property Awards 2016. And after the panel discussion yesterday on future architecture, I want to ask one of the panelists, Mr. Matthew Gall of Bagot, what he thought about those discussion and participation of the audience, whether it was at all progressive enough and interesting enough.
Look, I think it went really well. I think it's always interesting when you talk about the future of any kind of medium. We had 4 people there, myself and Alexander included, trying to talk about the future trends and the like. So, I think it was an interesting exercise of taking 4 individuals' experiences and ideas and talking about them in a discussion environment. Opening it up to the floor, I think, was a very good idea because it enabled the crowd to have a little bit of physical interaction with us on stage, and it kind of took the conversation in a different direction, which I think was really quite interesting.
Right. Okay. So, what about when you go back to the office? Okay, you're going to face up to some of these millennials and these difficult, like subordinates. What are you going to tell them? I mean, your team about future architecture. How are you going to deal with them?
It's about listening. It's about listening, and it's about
you listening or them listening.
Look, it's a two-way street.
Both.
It's a two-way street,
yeah.
Alexander. I think that we have to listen to them, and they have to listen to us. Like we can't all appear to be experts in everything because we're older. We have to understand that people who are younger may have an opinion which is just as valid as somebody who has more experience. And I think that's something that we talked about and touched on a lot in the panel discussion, that it's not so much about what you've learned and what you've been taught and maybe the degree that you've got. It's about opinion, and architecture is all about opinion, and so is design. Everybody has an opinion about what they think makes great design. So if you're a millennial and you have some amazing idea, it's about us listening to them and them listening to us, because we have seen a lot of things in our lifetime and in our albeit short lifetime, but and in our careers. So I think it's a two-way street. It's about listening in both ways.
Excellent. Thank you, Matthew from Bagot. So we'll come back to you guys later. Great. Now we're back with the panelists again, and we've got Trey here from Atkins, and he was one of the panelists yesterday. So we want to ask him what he thought of the discussion yesterday and the participation of the audience, in particular, the kind of enthusiasm that people expressed after the discussion. And Trey.
I feel the discussion yesterday was very, very interesting, and it was very engaging as well between the panelists and the audience as well. And the interesting thing about yesterday was that we find a common language between architects, designer, developer, and people engaged in the construction industry about the direction that architecture and design in the future is going to be heading. And it's all about communities, all about having respect toward the living environment surrounding our built environment. Another interesting thing about what we learned from yesterday was that the design process, both in architecture and design, is going to be more engaging with the community. It's no longer an exclusive platform for architects, engineer, or designer only. It will be with a wide range of stakeholders.
Okay, so when you go back to your office and you meet with all your junior architects, okay, or these millennials, even, these trainees, what are you going to say to them about the future of architecture?
As I said yesterday, the future for architecture and design has already started from yesterday. So don't wait until your future to come and do what you plan to do for the future. Do it from today.